Hello, students. Today we're going to talk about memory processing. So what is memory? So basically, it's how the brain receives, stores, and retrieves information for later use. We don't completely understand all of the processes or how memory exactly works, but there's a basic agreement. So the first thing you need to understand is the processes of memory. And the first process of memory is called encoding. Encoding is basically the process of getting information into memory. So kind of an interesting image here. What we're looking at is scientists have actually encoded information into the DNA of an E. coli bacteria, which I realize that this is sort of a low-res image, but what that means is that we're starting to be able to understand how we can biologically encode information the same way that memory does. So there may be a point where you don't even need to save things on a flash drive or on your phone. You can literally save it into your brain, which is kind of cool, but also kind of spooky. The second process of memory is known as storage. So storage is just retention of information, or like basically pulling something up again when you need to use it. And then the final process of memory is retrieval. So retrieval is once you've encoded something, once you have saved something, then you can retrieve it for use for later. You definitely want to know the three processes of memory: encoding, storage, and retrieval. So put another way, we have encoding, storage, and retrieval, just if you want another way of looking at this information. So the information processing model of memory, basically this model, or sometimes it's called the modal model, or sometimes it's called the Atkinson-Shiffrin model of memory, essentially says that memory happens in a stage-based process. So in the first stage, so essentially all around us, we have all this external information, stimuli like sights and smells and sounds and touches and tastes, and it's all just sort of like floating around us all the time. Information that we deem to be important, or information that we pay attention to, then goes into what's called our short-term memory, or sometimes it's called working memory. A little more on that in a minute. Information is important enough that we rehearse that information, we practice it, then it gets encoded into long-term memory. And then whenever we need to use that information later, we retrieve that information. So when we talk about sensory memory, the sensory memory stage is brief. So this was demonstrated by a guy named Sperling. And he flashed letters on a screen for 1/20th of a second. Then he asked participants how many letters they recalled. Usually participants without rehearsal could recall only about half of the letters that they saw. So then Sperling flashed the letters on a screen for another 20th of a second. And then after the screen went blank, he sounded a tone. And so if it was a high-pitched tone or medium tone or a low tone, that told the participants which row they were supposed to focus on. This caused information to be recalled almost perfectly. So when the sound happens right after the picture's flashed, we have a cue to retrieve that information. So we're going to do a little Sperling test here. So instead of sounds, we're going to do colors. So if you notice, I'm going to flash some letters on the screen. If those letters are in pink, that means you need to memorize the top row of letters. If the letters are red, then you need to memorize the middle row. And if the letters are purple, you need to memorize the bottom row. Now remember, memory is an attentive process. If you're not paying attention, you're not going to remember something. So pay attention now. Okay, so what color was it? What row? What letters do you remember? Okay, so let's do a little short-term memory test. I want you to remember the following letters. Don't write them down, just test yourself. Okay, were you able to remember those letters? Let's try again. Okay, probably still pretty easy. Let's try again. Okay, getting harder. Let's do another one. And here comes another one. Now, you may have thought that this became increasingly more difficult. That's because when we add more bits of information, uh, we only have a limited capacity for storage in short-term memory. So that magic number is 7 plus or minus 2. And what that means is, on average, people can store about 7 bits of information. Some of us can store 5, so that's the minus 2. And some of us can store up to 9, that's the plus 2. But on average, we can store about 7. This is why, for example, phone numbers are 7 digits long, because it's easier for us to remember that information. Okay, so short-term memory is the second stage of the information processing model. It's a limited capacity, so 7 plus or minus 2, or up to about 30 seconds. If you're distracted at any moment, this is going to cause a problem for you to be able to retrieve that information. So maybe someone has given you a phone number or something to remember, and you're trying to remember it, so you're repeating it over and over in your head, and then someone distracts you, and then poof, that information is gone. That's kind of what we're talking about here. Okay, so how can we better improve encoding? Well, we can use a process called chunking. So chunking is breaking down information into small chunks or bits of information. So let's try to memorize this long string of letters. I'll give you some time to memorize it now. Now, you may have seen this and just been like, well, I kind of give up, which is fine. So let's try chunking. So I'm going to break it up for you. Okay, so now we're looking at, here's some digestible chunks of information, some bits for you. But you're still probably thinking like, this doesn't really like help. So let me try it again. This time we're going to make the chunks into meaningful chunks. Now, would it be easier if you had to remember X, IDK, KFC, FBI, NAACP, ROFL, CVS, SUV, NBA, X? My thinking is it probably would. And so what that means is chunking works and it can be effective, but only if it's meaningful. And I think that's the case for just about anything that you're trying to memorize. If you can make the content relevant to yourself, it will make it easier for you to remember. Okay, so one like adaptation of short-term memory is what's called working memory. So some critics of the short-term memory model, or I should say the Atkinson-Shiffrin model or the modal model of memory, the idea that it's stage-based, so the stages being short-term, sensory, short-term, long-term. Working memory assumes that we're constantly manipulating information in real time. That short-term memory is more of an active process. Here, I'm going to skip this. Here, this is better. So the components of working memory are the visuospatial sketchpad, the episodic buffer, the phonological loop, the central executive. And you might be thinking to yourself, man, how am I going to remember this? Well, let me help you. So the visuospatial sketchpad is a fancy way of just saying stuff that you see, so visual information. The phonological loop is sound information, what we hear. We're constantly comparing that to what we have memorized before, or things that are personal or relevant to us. This is what the episodic buffer is. Think of the episodic buffer as like every day of your life is like an episode on a TV show. So it's information that's relevant to you. So an example of the visuospatial sketchpad and the phonological loop and the episodic buffer is you see flashing lights, you hear sirens, and you think to yourself, oh no, I think that's a police car, or it's a fire truck or an ambulance or something like that. So you're kind of like doing this in real time. Now, the central executive is you. You are the central executive. You're the CEO of yourself, meaning you direct your attention to wherever it needs to be. So you see these lights, you hear the sound, you might turn your head to look to see what it is, where the sound is coming from, or how far away that is from you. And so all of this is sort of like working in long-term memory. So another way of looking at the sensory memory, short-term memory, long-term memory model. Okay, So one issue with the way we remember things is what's called the serial position effect. And the serial position effect is that when we're given a list of information, we tend to remember the beginning of the list and the end of the list, but we forget the things that are in the middle. So if you remember the beginning of a list, this is the primacy effect. If you can remember just the end of the list, this is the recency effect. So sometimes this is called the primacy recency effect or the serial position effect. So what this means is it's not just about memorizing a list. This applies to anything, job interviews, dates, things like that. So if you're having a date and you say something foolish in the middle of the date, that's okay because your date is going to remember the beginning of the date and the end of the date. Unless what you did in the middle of the date was like really, really bad and then the date ends. So like, keep that in mind. Or you'll tend to remember the beginning of what happens at the beginning of a class and the end of the class, but forget the middle of the class. Or the same with even the school year. You remember the beginning of the school year and the end of the school year. So you can use this to your advantage. So the last thing I want to talk today about is levels of processing. So there are essentially 3 levels of processing. There's shallow, there's intermediate, and there's deep. So shallow is when we're trying to remember something and we just look at the physical features of whatever it is we're trying to memorize. So we're processing it at a very shallow level. Intermediate process is when you start to notice like more details, like does the word rhyme? And then deep processing is when we're actually thinking about the word itself, what it means, how it connects to us. So the last thing I want to talk about is encoding information into long-term memory. So there are 2 ways that you can do this. There's maintenance rehearsal and there's elaborative rehearsal. So maintenance rehearsal is just repetition. It's probably how you study for many of your classes. You just repeat something over and over, hoping it's going to stick. And it will. But what tends to happen is after you use that information, it goes away. So elaborative rehearsal is how I'm going to try to teach you psychology as we go through this semester. I'm going to make connections, I'm going to give you my own personal connections that work for me, that have helped me in the past. But I encourage you to make your own connections to the material. So again, here's another example of levels of processing theory, just in case you need it. And one more time. But that, ladies and gentlemen, is all I have for you today. If you have any questions, please let me know. Otherwise, have a great day.